Age of Wonders 4 has a very detailed research system, and a very rewarding one at that, through its tomes of magic. In this video, I'm going to break down the basic tomes of magic across the 6 affinities, for all of the juicy detail and unlocks that they offer. Here on screen is the kind of things that I'll be consider as I go through and make my assessments, and there'll be time cards handily linked below if you'd like to bounce between any sections or nuke the watch time. And finally, if you could leave a like and subscribe, that would mean heaps on a big video like this. And so let's begin. We're going to start at the top and work our way down, and that means we're looking at the Astral affinity first. Starting with the Tome of Evocation, and I think that actually we're starting with a fairly decent pick here. Some standout things to point out are the fact that we have access to a summoning unit. Granted, of course, it's just a lesser storm spirit, but nonetheless, this is a tier 1 tome, and that's a decent pickup. We also get the Evoker, which is one of our units that will train instead, and a Battle Mage unit. And of course, there's a strong synergy here as well around lightning, right? And you'll see that again and again. There's an enemy army spell to deal damage. Of course, we have the very powerful lightning blades just to feed into that. Finally, 2 more spells, a damaging spell, which deals a reasonable amount of lightning damage, and then a unit enchantment to top it all off. I think this is a really solid opener. Of course, we get some extra casting points, our wonderful lightning weapons. We also have the channeling tower as the improvement and the affinity. But as I mentioned in the intro, some things I'll weight higher and some things will be a little lower. The wider combinations that you might make with the tomes could be outside of the scope of my evaluation. But looking at what we have in front of us, I think we have a really solid introduction. As a well-rounded tier 1 tome with power, with a couple of different units on offer that are reasonably strong in their own rights, I think that the Tome of Evocation, our first ranking, so it's an important one, will be ranked at an A tier. I'm a big fan of this one. I think it's got lots of power early on, lots of diversity, and great synergy within. Our second tier 1 tome in the Astral affinity is the Tome of Warding. Here, a little bit less of an initial bonus. Instead, we get the support hero skill, bolstering support, which is reasonable enough, but there are a lot of good support hero skills. Let's take a look at what it actually has to offer. One thing that I'm quite a big fan of myself is the summon Phantasm Warrior. I think the Phantasm Warrior is a fairly reasonable unit. It's got lightning damage, that's great. You'll notice that we don't receive, however, a traditional unit unlock inside of the Tome of Warding. What we do receive is a friendly unit buff spell that makes us invulnerable for 1 turn only. We have a unit enchantment spell that gives us a little bit of extra bolstered resistance. There is a skill level 3 buff spell that targets a friendly unit, gains a shield with a base 60% chance of inflicting stunned on the attackers. Reasonable enough, but 60% not that great. There are a lot of spells that'll reach higher than that. And then we have a minor race transformation here, slapped inside of course, a tier 1 tome. In this case, it grants us a little bit of extra defense resistance against lightning, fire, and frost. Now, race transformations generally tend to be pretty good, and this one may not be the best of the lot, but it's reasonable enough if you're coming up against magical foes. However, I think that the Tome of Warding is significantly weaker, particularly compared to, obviously, its direct competitor, the one that we just looked at, the Tome of Evocation. It's weaker across the board in delivering less. I think it has slightly less internal synergy, and the lack of units in comparison isn't really made up for by this minor race transformation, in my opinion. With not quite as much on offer, both in terms of breadth, but also depth and pure strength, it's hard for me to really recommend this tome, especially in comparison to the Tome of Evocation. It is for those reasons that I'm choosing to place the Tome of Warding at a C tier. Moving on to tier 2, which of course we can unlock as soon as we have 2 tomes from tier 1, not necessarily of course from within the same chapters of the library or the same affinity, i.e. Astral. We arrive at the Tome of Scrying, and this one is about vision. True sight inflicting marked on the enemy. What does it deliver? Well, we get a little bit of a hero skill, essentially. This one, battle magic, precognition, physical range, ranged and magic attacks ignore accuracy penalties from the obscuring condition caused by units in the way and certain terrain. Okay, it is what it is. What do we actually get that's tangible? Well, we have a summoning spell here that we can summon a Watcher, a Battle Mage unit, so if we missed out on one earlier on, potentially this is our opportunity to pick one up. The Watcher has reasonable hit points and a fairly high 36 damage Psychic Gaze, which is nothing to be scoffed at. However, of course, we always need to take into account and keep in mind that many of these units will have upkeep. And you need to factor that in when you're factoring in how many you can summon. Outside of that, I would note probably the Tower of True Sight is a city structure. We haven't seen the likes of city structure yet, so it's important to point that out. This would allow you to essentially find hidden units, something that's not especially impactful in Age of Wonders 4, or at least something that can be fairly easily played around. The rest of these are either unit spells in terms of enchantments or army spells, and by and large, I don't think they're especially strong, with perhaps the exception of guided projectiles, which could be used to combo in and get some fairly nice things going from within your army. I don't think there's enough strength here in any of these spells to really set this tome apart from many of the others. It's for those reasons that I'm scribing this one down into a C tier. I think actually for a lot of the same reasons as Warding, just didn't quite have enough versatility or power within the tome to really set it at a B tier or greater in my opinion. The second tier 2 tome is the Tome of Amplification, and I think that this one is very strong. You'll notice, of course, we have 6 unlocks instead of 5, but that's not why I'm giving it that. It's instead actually thanks to this, not just the hero skill, though I should note that the hero skill does make tactical spells give plus 20% more damage, but also because of this wonderful pylon here. It's a combat spell. You can summon it in battle, a stationary structure that increases the damage of your spells by 20%. We also have a relatively interesting sustained city spell that can give you 20 extra knowledge if you've got some stability to trade off. I'd also like to point out the minor race transformation here gives us attunement fortune, which is a great way to increase our critical hit chance. Critical hits, I believe, deal an extra 50%. Yes, 50% extra damage. There's also, of course, morale factoring in around that. And then we just have some generally fairly decent spells. Chain lightning damage spell, 20 damage that chains on. Here we have a physical ranged attack enhancement that will give us extra lightning damage feeding into that as well. This one across the board is really nice. There's a lot of strength throughout here and a lot of really powerful abilities. Notwithstanding, of course, the fact that our magic, both our tactical spells and also our combat spells while we're in the battlefield can deal an extra 20%. There's some very powerful effects considering how early you unlock the Tome of Amplification. Thanks to its wide range of impacts, particularly those early damage buffing spells that'll have a big impact on our armies, we'll also have a special improvement as well that can give us extra casting points, which are somewhat harder to come by than a lot of other resources in the game. And it is for all of those reasons that I'm giving this tome our first honor of S tier. I think it does deserve that slot. It's iffy. I could see arguments for it being placed at A as well, don't get me wrong, but I'm going to give it a relatively low but nonetheless significant S tier ranking. After unlocking any 2 tier 2 tomes, we get access to tier 3. The first one that we're presented with in Astral is the Tome of Summoning. Obviously, as the name would suggest, it's all about summoning, and you can see that reflected in its special improvement, which gives a little bit of mana and knowledge per adjacent conduit, if you can muster up some of those. And then our battle magic expert hero skill is, at the start of combat, summon an Astral Wisp. I'm generally a fan of extra abilities that summon extra units. It's important to note that this is more of a token unit than anything else, but the option is there. Inside of the tome, we're presented with a few interesting things. Firstly, you'll notice that we have the Astral Serpent, which is a unit that we can summon in. It is honestly not that great compared to a lot of its peers. It's a tier 3 unit, its damage is relatively low, and of course you'll be paying for it a lot, not just to produce it, but then in upkeep. I argue there are many other better options within this tier, within this class of unit, and for this price. Don't get me wrong, if it's your favorite unit out there, you do you, keep using it, but I just don't think it quite compares to a lot of the other things on offer. Outside of that, we have Arcane Restoration. Restoring spells are always really nice. Healing all Magic Origin units with an extra 20 temporary hit points can never be a bad thing. And then there's also this buff spell, which targets friendly Magic Origin units, bolsters their defense and strength, static charge for 3 turns. Now, don't get me wrong, there's nothing inherently particularly bad about a lot of these abilities, but I think that they are generally outclassed by a lot of other things, not just within this tier, but honestly, many of the earlier tomes will outpace a lot of these effects. It's important to note. While Conjure Astral Keeper might be fairly reasonable and fun as a combat spell to cast, I don't think it alone, as well as a couple of other strengths, can really save the day here. Overall, not a terrible tome. Some highlights, some questionable spells. I think it actually ranks fairly middle of the road, and it's going to be our first B tier ranking. Not quite reaching for the ultimate power of the S or A tier, but some nice in-battle effects, I think, lift this tome up to a B tier rank. Our second option at tier 3 for the Astral Tomes is the Tome of Teleportation, and this one is very powerful, and I think it's important to note that teleportation abilities generally are very strong. Here, of course, we have a hero skill, makes the caster teleport to a hex, doing it within battle. That's great, that's fun. The real power, though, comes from this kind of thing anyway. Here we have a world spell, makes target friendly army teleport back to the nearest owned city. Fantastic. We have an emergency teleportation healing spell, makes the closest allied unit teleport to within 4 hexes of a target hex and heals it. We have phasing enchantment. The phase ability is unlocked on units. And we have a building which is nice enough, 10 gold income, 3 for each astral trade relay built in your empire. Is it the best structure of all time? Not necessarily, no, but the teleportation impacts and the strategic importance of being able to teleport armies, for example, back to a city cannot be understated. As for the beast here, we have a summoning spell for a shock unit, a somewhat powerful one, sure. Again, keep your upkeep costs in mind. I can't knock the Phase Beast though, I think it's a decent unit. What I think is really great is also this Chrono Gate, a special tile improvement, +3 mana per conduit, +3 knowledge per conduit, grants evasion, but crucially, it functions as a teleporter, a teleporting province, one way, and you could argue actually almost the best way for us to traverse around the map and around our empire outside of these one-off or potentially emergency options. Overall, I think the strength in the Tome of Teleportation is very clear, unlocking powers and opportunities that you may not otherwise get at all, or you might get much later in the piece. The Tome of Teleportation is teleporting its way right up to the top, and it's taking first place. This one so far is definitively the best tier tome that we've ranked, in my opinion, and absolutely worthy of that S tier status. At tier 4, now we're getting interesting because we're going to need 6 of the appropriate affinity as well as having 2 tier 3 tomes researched. So there's a little bit of a step up, of course, for our tier 4s and tier 5s in comparison to the rest. Here we have Tome of the Astral Mirror, and I think as far as tomes go, this one is okay. Magic Deflection, our hero skill that we're picking up, but what are we actually getting? Well, we're getting this Summon Mirror Mimic, which is a summoning spell, providing a unit which is okay. It's a mythic unit, of course, that can take the form of other units, gaining their abilities and healing themselves. If you can pick up a powerful unit, you're going to be in top fighting form. If not, you're going to be left a little bit out on your own. The other things here are really about units and leaders impacting damage back onto the enemy, shielding yourself, or potentially reflecting damage back, as you can see here in Mirror Veil. We also have a couple of other somewhat interesting changes. I think Throne of Mirrors is a great example. When the city is besieged, grants the defender an astral reflection of their ruler if they are not present themselves. Astral reflection is a copy of another unit that deals half the amount of damage. So there are little sort of ways that you can either get back at your opponent by reflecting damage, be a little bit sneaky here. Units and cities gain +7 vision range. That's obviously incredibly significant of a buff. However, does vision range compare to some of the other things that we can unlock? Not necessarily, no, or at least it's not quite as important. So don't get me wrong, strong abilities, though they are somewhat situationally dependent, they can be plan Bs or backups or overall things that are actually slightly more aligned with espionage and that kind of thing, vision range, etc. I don't think it's a bad tome, but I do think it's a little bit of an unusual one. I'm going to rank Tome of the Astral Mirror, our first tier 4 tome, at a B tier ranking. Like I say, interesting effects, very unique effects, not necessarily bad ones, but I don't think anything is especially good enough to warrant lifting the entire tome up to a higher rank. Things get quite spicy when we move through to look at Tome of the Astral Convergence. Here we have some very interesting abilities. We have a siege project that will destroy enemy towers and deal damage. Over on Astral Shattering, you can destroy any province on the world and summon a powerful army of marauding astral sea creatures into it. You also have, down the bottom left here, a major race transformation for the tome. This one allows units to pass through obstacles and will receive +1 mana and knowledge for every population. Not a terrible major race transformation, not the strongest one that we'll see, but quite interesting, opens up a few other interesting ways to play. Generally not a bad ability. We also have a combat spell which summons a tier 2 astral sea creature into a fight. Big fan of abilities that can give us extra units over the normal unit cap, which would of course be 18 versus 18 for the units that we're walking around with in the world, but not, of course, ones that we can summon in during combat. It'll also deal a little bit of extra damage. Overall, I think that the Tome of Astral Convergence is a very strong tome with some powerful effects. Given it holds that major race transformation and otherwise has some fairly powerful, fairly strong effects. Of course, it is a tier 4 tome, though I place less of a weighting on that in comparison to some other things. I'm going to rank this one at an A tier. I think it's a really strong contender. You generally couldn't go wrong picking it up, particularly, of course, if you're playing down that build. A solid pick, tier A worthy. And now we have our big bad boy, Tome of the Archmage, the only tier 5 tome. Of course, our requirements now being that we need 8 affinity total, and we need to have researched 2 tomes from the previous tier 4. We can only have 1 tier 5 tome researched. Not that that should be much of a problem, considering the kind of effort that you need to put in to get these and how long a game may last. This one provides us with a little bit of everything that we've seen so far. Of course, it's important to note that tier 5 tomes are and should be in a strength level of their own, so we'll have to keep that in mind as we move through and I introduce you to more of them and rank more of them. But let's take a look at what this does. We have a debuff spell that stuns, distracts, and marks enemies within a 1 hex radius. Okay. We have an Astral Travel World spell that makes our leader teleport to the target world hex. Pretty strong. Very flexible. We have Cosmic Drive. This unit enchantment is very powerful. It grants plus 30% damage to our magic origin and combat summon units, as well as gives them very fast movement. This is just a wide-reaching, strong ability, and I rate that very highly. Lastly, we have Disruption Wave. Disables enemy unit enchantments for 3 turns, dispels all positive status effects and on the enemies, and gets rid of our negative ones. When you combine this with the extra damage, it's hard not to argue that Tome of the Archmage is obviously incredibly powerful. Really strong effects here across the board. I think it is perhaps not the strongest of the tier 5 tomes, though. I think that we'll see some stronger ones to come. Look, I can't deny its strength, of course, a tier 5 tome. It has some great abilities that stretch into the battlefield and give us a little bit of sort of tactical supremacy or superiority outside of it as well, particularly with our teleportation. I am going to rank this tome, our first tier 5 tome, at an A tier. A really solid contender, a powerful tome, though not the best in class that we will see, and I don't think it's the best bang for your buck within the Astral affinity either, considering how much earlier we can unlock some abilities, especially from those tomes that I've ranked up there in the S tier. Alright, you chaotic lot, let's move on to Chaos now. Of course, we're looking at the Chaos Affinity, and the first tome is Tome of the Horde. This is one that you can pick up, of course, almost right from the start. What does it offer in particular? Well, a few things. We'll start with our minor race transformation, which will increase the number of units, and crucially, give us plus 20% damage. Very early on. Very strong ability. I rate that highly. We'll also grab the Houndmaster, a ranged unit that summons a Warhound. Now this is important, again, because it can push us over that cap. I won't mention this every time for summoned units moving forward. I have mentioned it once before in this video. This will be possibly the last time, but it's important to note that when we draw into combat with our normal units that we're traversing the map with, the limit is 18 versus 18. Once we get inside, however, we can summon extra units or potentially build them through siege projects. Here we have the ability to summon a Warhound. Very good, considering how early on we get it. Outside of that, we could also summon in a completely random unit using our mana from Summon Irregulars. All friendly tier 1 units become buffed, combos very nicely, of course, with things like the Warhound, with things like Summon Irregulars, and then lastly, a little bit of fire damage on top. I think that Tome of the Horde, in case you can't tell, is very powerful. A very powerful minor race transformation early, and some good units with reasonable synergy around them. Tome of the Horde, you spoil me. You deliver a little bit of everything. You deliver it very early in the game. I mean, even just that 20% damage buff alone is great, notwithstanding the extra token units and synergies around those. I'm going to give Tome of the Horde an S tier. I think it deserves a spot right up the top for that incredible value early on. The Tome of Pyromancy I'm less convinced on, especially compared to its twin brother Tome of the Horde. I'm not sure it quite delivers for us here. Obviously there's a focus around fire damage, whether you're dealing it to enemies or enchanting your own units. You can see there's a couple of damage spells to deal it, and then a couple of enchantment spells to add it to your largely melee or ranged units. So of course you've got a physical focus here. We can summon in a lesser Magma Spirit, not bad, but again, these lesser spirits, keep in mind that they are little babies and will need some extra experience to grow up big and strong. And here we unlock our Battle Mage unit. It's skill level 2, its damage is reasonable enough. You'll probably want to be training or recruiting them when you get it, so this isn't by any means a bad pick, but of course we do have other unit options, including summoning them in, and it's important to keep that in mind. The internal synergy here is nice, with a focus on using our spells to cast damage or enchant, and then bringing in our newly trained unit, potentially with some lesser spirits to grow up, so I can't really fault it on that. The Ritual Pyre provides a reasonable amount of mana, combos with foresters, nothing terrible, and here we have essentially the opposite of the lightning buffs that we were looking at earlier, but this time for fire. I think the fire strat can absolutely be a viable one, perhaps not quite as strong as some of what the other tomes have offered. I also think that given it doesn't have a lot of the things and the crucial things that the previous tome in Chaos offered, like the minor race transformation, I can't justify giving it an S or really even an A tier. I think that this tome, the Tome of Pyromancy, sits quite happily at either a B or potentially a high C tier. I'm somewhat on the fence about this one, but I think I've rested on leaving it at the lower end, granted, of a B tier ranking. Next up, we have the Tome of Revelry, which focuses in around morale and experience, and you'll notice a lot of its pictures are pretty in pink. We have a siege project that takes away a little bit of morale, buffs a little bit of morale, of course, leading into that theme. We see that as well in the unit enchantments, giving morale additional strength. Over here, units in the target-friendly army gain 30% experience from combat for 3 turns. That is reasonable, but if your opponent is using their spells to, say, strike you down or heal themselves, then extra experience may not necessarily be that great of a priority. And I think that that overall theme somewhat lets this tome down. As a minor race transformation, plus 50% morale from all sources isn't strictly a terrible one, but again, if I can, say, buff myself with an extra 20% damage one tome earlier, are you going to be in a better position for giving yourself 50% extra morale a tome later? I'm just not sure that the strength here really compares with a lot of stuff that's on offer. We do, of course, unlock our recruitable support unit, not a completely terrible unit by any stretch of the imagination. Some somewhat useful buffs here, some somewhat useful abilities. Overall, a decent unlock, but I think that the tome itself is let down by really a lack of just pure strength. There isn't enough upfront to offer to keep competitive with everyone else if all you're doing is buffing your morale. If you're short on morale, then this will be a great fix for that. But if you're not, if you're trending along around average, which you probably ought to be, I don't think that Revelry gives us enough. Reveler's Triumph and the Carnival of Flesh, combined with a couple of alright abilities, may be the only thing actually for me at the moment that is saving me from giving Revelry a D tier ranking. I will rank Revelry at C tier. I think that's roughly where it belongs, just because it doesn't quite have the impact, it doesn't have the weight to carry that the rest of these tomes have offered. The Tome of Mayhem at Tier 2 is about inflicting misfortune on the enemy and causing them to stumble, randomly displacing them, as well as improving and buffing our own army. The Siege Project makes at the start of battle enemy units displaced by 4 hexes and they gain that misfortune fumble, so we're trying to sort of weaken them down with a variety of spells, including making our base attacks inflict that misfortune. Everything revolves around adding misfortune to the enemy, trying to make them stumble, and you'll see that across everything, with the exception, of course, of this summoning spell, which summons a gremlin onto the map, a gremlin that is actually a pretty interesting unit. Its strength might not be necessarily as great as the rest, but it is an option for us to summon something in, and it's probably the best summoning option that we've had so far. If you can stack some of these misfortune buffs, they can come through and deliver reasonable power, though I'm not sure that it's necessarily the best strategy. And again, somewhat similarly to Revelry, I'm not sure it delivers a massive amount of power. I think that Mayhem does stand slightly above Revelry in terms of its overall strength, though. If you can stack a few of those 10% fumble chances, you might just find that you are in a fight with a bunch of buffoons and baboons. It is slightly more offensive, I suppose, in that way, and perhaps slightly more useful. I'm going to rank it at a B tier ranking. Here we have the Tome of Pandemonium, which is about negative status effects. You can see that potentially here inside of Havoc Magic, which is a unit enchantment, grants base magic attacks a 30% chance of inflicting a random negative status effect. So you've got a 3 in 10 chance of doing so. You'll see also you could use a debuff spell to do that yourself. We have a minor race transformation that gives plus 10% damage for each of the target's negative status effect. And we have Insight Revolution, which is actually a world spell, destroying a province and summoning a brigand camp. So there is synergy here for negative effects. However, there isn't actually a huge way to cast them. We have this debuff spell, which inflicts random status effects on all units within a relatively small, but significant enough, I suppose, 1 hex radius. And then we have Havoc Magic, which means that some of our units will have a 30% chance. This combines with the unit in the tome, which is the Chaos Eater. And the Chaos Eater in of itself is a very expensive unit to cast and to hold, and its damage is very low. Chaos Bolts dealing 7. It's all about, for this, consuming chaos, removing negative status effects from the enemies, dealing 12 random elemental damage for each one removed, and lifesteal, so you'll heal. This in of itself isn't terrible. The trouble is it removes the effect, so you're casting it again, removing the effect. Maybe you're removing a couple of effects, potentially, at this point. Maybe 24 damage and a bit of lifesteal is reasonable enough. But at a base level, it doesn't quite do enough. And I think that can be said actually for the tome as a whole. I don't think it quite does enough. I don't think there are quite enough ways to give reliable debuffs on the enemies, negative status effects. I think that the overall impact of the world spell is not too dissimilar from other world spells, to be fair, fairly run-of-the-mill, and the rest of this stuff, including this quite weak minor race transformation, just doesn't stand up to a lot of other things. I think the internal synergy is there, but very weak. It is for the first, but not the last time on this list that I'm giving the Tome of Pandemonium a D tier. I think it tries in a similar way that Revelry tries to lean into something, and it just doesn't quite even do that as well as Revelry. The synergy isn't there, the power isn't there. For me, it's a D tier pick in the tier 3 tomes. Our next tier 3 tome is Devastation. Devastation has a lot of stuff around sieges and dealing damage, including these units that you can construct as a siege project, again pushing us over that traditional 18 versus 18 cap limit to Devastator spheres. We also have Unleash the Hounds, which brings in 6. In terms of normal unit unlocks, we unlock a, quote, monstrous shock unit, and it is monstrous. At tier 4, of course, it's dealing a lot of damage. It'll cost you a lot of gold, draft, etc. to train it up, but it will be worth your time. It's quite a powerful unit. Combine that with maybe a little bit of an extra critical hit chance with flame burst weapons, or this unit enchantment, which gives you Demolisher, allowing you to destroy fortified obstacles, and a 60% chance of cancelling the enemy's defense mode. This tome is really about grabbing a fist and punching with it. You punch with your 2 extra siege projects, giving you a lot of diversity and strength. You've got a very powerful unit to unlock, and reasonable spells, enchantments to go along with it. I think that this one is especially strong, actually. The Tome of Devastation is a very good pickup. Obviously, it leans into domination in particular, but you can even play around that in other ways. You may not necessarily be going for domination when you're besieging an enemy, and I think that the overall unit buffs alone, even, actually, when you combine it with the War Breed, would be good enough to give this at least an average ranking. Stack the extra siege potential on top, and I think we're looking at an above average tome. The Tome of Devastation, for me, initially I was going to place it at a B tier, but I think that it does actually quite genuinely deserve to be above average. Is it going to break the game? No, but I think it's very good, and for that reason, I'll be ranking it at an A tier. In tier 4, we have Tome of the Demon Gate. Opens a rift to summon fields and burn the world in your wake. Okay, so what do we actually get? Well, we get our major race transformation here inside of this tome, which is always exciting. In this case, we turn into Demonkin, granting us burning immunity, faster movement, we can fly, and we have Frenzy, increase dealing of damage as we attack. The other thing probably to note within this tome is that there's a lot of spells, summoning spells, terraforming spells, unit enchantment, and damage. So we tick off all of the boxes. We also get the Demon Gate, which will function as a teleporter here for us. So we're unlocking that at tier 4. It's also a deploy location. We can also use it to produce some of our many fiend units, which have their own buffs. The terraforming spell, which is also something to keep an eye out for as we move through the list. In this case, terraforms into that desolate terrain, deals fire damage to enemies. So there's some slight aggressive potential, but maybe not massive. The other one, I guess, is Fight for Power, is probably worth noting. 2 fiend units of the same tier in the target army fight one another. One dies, transforms into a more powerful one. So you can bring back that sort of tokenizing effect from earlier on, from some of the earlier tomes, potentially even the Horde, and structure this using that as your base. Overall, I think that Demon Gate is a reasonable enough tome. However, at tier 4, you have to be really strong to compete. Demon Gate delivers a major race transformation. Because it delivers a major race transformation, I don't think I'm actually going to put it where I had initially planned to put it, which was at C tier, and instead place it at a B tier. It really is just a couple of things lifting it up from a lower rank. I'm fairly happy with that placement. Next, we have Chaos Channeling, offers some very interesting abilities. Firstly, a minor transformation, which of course can be stacked with other minors, will give us immunity to burning, something that we saw earlier. Vengeful Flames, which damages melee attackers, some fire resistance, and Fiery Wake, which ignites flammable terrain. Very good for a minor transformation, of course unlocked relatively late in the piece. We also have Golden Horde, which is very similar to one of the abilities on the tree that you can only get once, but in this case we can use it over and over. It's a summoning spell, summoning a full army of random granted tier 1 units, although again there is some synergy for that within class that can be produced for a city on a target hex. So we can magic up some fairly weak armies out of almost nowhere. Whenever another unit dies in battle, we get strength and temporary hit points, not terrible. This damage spell has a 2 hex radius, which I would note is wider than many others, casting, of course, fire everywhere as you go. And then there's this other one, which lets us summon a gremlin every turn in combat, up to 5 gremlins in total. We, of course, would use this on a city, whether you fight in that domain. Whenever you do so, I should say, you'll receive a gremlin, 1 per turn for 5 turns. I think Chaos Channeling is a pretty powerful tome, has some really nice effects. With a minor race transformation, almost better than the major one, especially if you consider that you're not limited to but 1 minor race transformation, and overall solid abilities, solid spells, and pretty versatile in combat. I'm going to give this one an A tier ranking. I think it's absolutely worthy of that slot, and if I was ranking it from best to worst, I'd probably place it somewhere in the middle, but for now, that spot will do just nicely. And lastly, my lord, we have Tome of the Chaos Lord, which lets you summon a unit that personally I really like the flavor for. It's Balor. Balor is summoned in, a targeting city loses 2 population and spawns Balor, mythic unit. Loads of different abilities here on offer. I would also note Death Explosion is one of its things. Otherwise, this is our tier 5 tome. So we set a high bar, we can only get one of these. What else does it offer? All attacking units gain extra momentum and hastened per turn, very strong, sure. Insight Rebellion, a targeted city, units are mind controlled, and it suffers a stability penalty when it's being besieged. Good, not as good as some of the other things in this tier though, I would say. And then we have a combat spell. A tier 5 combat spell that summons an avatar of your ruler. The avatar has the same abilities as your leader, spawns with full action points, all fiends and demonkin gain morale. So basically, you can spawn a second one of you. Pretty decent, honestly, pretty decent. And all of these abilities are, as you would expect with a tier 5 tome. However, I think there are more powerful tomes than this one. I am a big fan of Balor. I do think that Call Forth has some versatility. I think there's potentially less strength, however, in these other two. I don't think they quite do enough to lift it up and surge this tome any higher than around a middle of the road ranking. I give Chaos Lord a passing grade, but only just. It's a C tier tome for me. Because of its tier 5 status, it of course sets the bar fairly high, and I don't think it quite delivers as well as the others in class. Next we move on to Imperium, what I think could be one of the weaker collection of tomes in the game. Starting at number 1, we have the ability to summon our first golem, Copper Golem, tier 1 polearm unit. Not terrible, we're not going to be spending a lot else on summoning units, so we might as well. The city spell here is interesting enough, trading a little bit of stability for production and draft, of course, leaning into that slightly warlike and physical damage focus that we have here. A little bit of extra range for our units, nice enough, perhaps nothing to write home about to your mum. A little bit of extra resistance, and finally Sundering Blades, a 90% chance of sundering their defense, and Demolisher as well, so you can stomp through objects. The Tome of Enchantment isn't terrible, but I can move through it fairly quickly because it's fairly straightforward. Nothing here is particularly exciting, particularly diverse, or particularly strong. However, it's not strictly a bad pick either. As far as tier 1 tomes go, I think it's fairly decent. It provides a bit of versatility, it provides a little bit of extra strength for your units, and a unit to summon in, which is always nice in the early game. I think that the Tome of Enchantment deserves a B tier ranking. Next, we have the Tome of Rock, which does have a minor transformation within it, although it's potentially one of the weaker transformations on offer, basically just giving us a +1 defense. And also you can walk along rocks faster and make yourself look a bit like a rock. You can also summon in a little rock. Here we have another Lesser Spirit, the Lesser Spirit option, of course, for this class. Outside of that, I think that the buff spell is fairly weak. Stone Skin, nothing to write home about. This spell also lets you lob a big rock at an enemy and deal 30 damage, but that's about it. And then, of course, we unlock a Flying Shock unit, Gargoyle, a fairly weak unit, although its charging strike can pack a punch, it's important to note. Over on the right-hand side, the Special Province is good, perhaps nothing to write home about, but a reasonable source of draft nonetheless. Did I say draft? I mean production. Either way, the Tome of Rock is a little bit underwhelming, really. It is a bit underwhelming. Its transformation is underwhelming. Its spells are fairly straightforward and don't quite pack enough of a punch for me to warrant putting it above the rest. For me, it's a close call between a C tier and a D tier. I think it gives quite a bit, but nothing it gives is particularly strong or eventful. And that's a shame because at tier 1, there are actually a surprising amount of very strong picks. And I think that this, honestly, has to be right down there with almost the worst. I'm going to rank this one at a low C tier ranking. The Tome of Artificing at tier 2, I think, is one of the better tomes inside of this Materium library. I think the Iron Golem is a really nice unlock, a unit that we can, of course, train with our draft, build with our gold, rather than summon it in. It's a powerful unit. It's shielded, it's elemental, and while its damage isn't overwhelming, it's a great blocker, particularly for this era, this sort of period of the game. The other thing that we get are nice defenses, the defensive side of the offensive magic that we may have seen before. In this case, we can construct bolt repeaters. We also get the Artisan Fortification city structure. Finally, we have a little bit of siege magic for some extra damage as the siege breaker, and Artisan Armaments, which gives our units a fairly decent plus 30% critical hit chance. Of course, that applies to our Iron Golem, so the internal synergy here is very real. The Gold Mine is a decent enough province improvement that'll leverage off the fact that you probably already have a few quarries around. Maybe you want to get an extra mine. I would note it's a fun one as well because it spawns an Iron Golem on the owner's side for combat. Just a little fun thing to note. There are other ways to do this, of course, but that's one. Here's another one to get a free Iron Golem through Golem Assistant, a hero support effect that I'm a particular fan of, even though it does just summon a tier 1 token unit. I think that the Iron Golem and really important structures like potentially the Bolt Repeaters or your more aggressive siege magic do wonders for the Tome of Artificing. I think it's a really solid pick, potentially the best in this tier, at least as far as Materium is concerned. Don't get me wrong, not the best overall, but I think a really strong contender nonetheless, particularly because of its relatively early unlock time. I'm placing it at an A tier. The Tome of Winds provides us with 6 different things. You'll notice that 2 of them are units. There's a Wind Rager that we can summon in, and then we have a ranged unit, an archer, and actually a pretty decent one at that. Of course, these slightly stronger units will have more upkeep, etc., but this one is a nice ranged unit. Honestly, it is. Outside of that, a lot of these spells I find to be a bit underwhelming. It targets an empty hex and pulls the closest enemy to within 3 hexes of that location. Is alright, potentially for pulling one enemy out, but nothing to write home about. There's a unit enchantment that grants enchanted units flying mounts. Our scout will benefit from that at the minute, but of course it could go a little wider than just one unit. And then there's a combination of friendly army and debuff spells that overall aren't bad, but I don't think that this kind of thing, even Dust Storm, for example, is particularly strong, nor is it especially a good use of my somewhat limited combat and sort of casting points. Not terrible, but not great. I think that the units are potentially a little bit of a saving grace for the Tome of Winds. Thanks to that slight uplifting wind at the end, I think that Tome of Winds deserves a B tier ranking for its general strength in unit provision and okay spells. The Tome of Transmutation comes in at tier 3, focusing on debuffing enemies, buffing your allies, and, quote, changing your economy. We unlocked a Battle Mage unit, not a terrible unit, fairly run-of-the-mill. And then the rest here, we're looking at spells. I would note that our Minor Transformation gives us a little bit of defense, Blight Resist, -2 Lightning Resistance, however. Not one that I would write home about. And then outside of that, you're looking at changing your city, gaining sundered defense and fire damage thrown at the enemy, and then some adaptive armor as well. I think that these abilities, including the adaptive armor, are not all that great, to be honest. There's not a huge amount of power tucked in most of this stuff, and there are some downsides, potentially, that you might not want to take on. I think that overall, the Tome of Transmutation doesn't quite provide enough strength to set it even at an average ranking. It's for all of those reasons that the Tome of Transmutation is going to transmute itself down here into a C ranking. I think it's just a bit underpowered across the board. And while it does provide diversity in what it offers, it doesn't really have the strength to back any of it up. The Tome of Terramancy is our other option at tier 3, one that I've played around with quite a bit. Important things to note: Tremor Ritual at the start of combat. The siege project will destroy towers, battlements, and additional wall obstacles. A fairly nice breakdown of at least some of the earlier siege defenses. Seismic Shock is sort of a little bit smaller, more of a damage spell based on the actual fighting. Other than that, the terraforming spell that adds the rocky feature, perhaps not especially useful. Yes, I know there's synergies, you can become rock people, move a bit faster, but that feature isn't strictly one that you'll be reaching for very often. And then we have the Stone Spirit, a tier 3 fighting unit that we can summon. Of course, nice to be able to summon it in at a slightly higher strength than we may have seen it earlier on. I think that Tremor Ritual is potentially, though, the only real saving grace here. As a siege project, it's not a bad one. The rest of these abilities I could easily take or leave most. In fact, probably all of them. I don't think that the Tome of Terramancy is an especially strong tome of magic, and I think that the Tremor Ritual, while it does a little bit to lift it up, doesn't really do it enough for me. There are plenty of other ways to destroy siege projects, and I don't think that beelining to this tome for that effect is really enough to set it apart from the rest. Unfortunately, it's a tome that I quite like, that I've experimented with quite a bit, but I don't think it compares in class. There are many other tier 1, 2, and of course 3 tomes that are just better than it, and unfortunately, I will be placing it at a D tier ranking. Next, we move to the Golden Realm, a tier 4 tome, and one that I think is worth your time. The Gold Golem is a huge, big, powerful unit. Towers above the rest. It can walk up to walls during a fight and just stab across them. In all seriousness, though, it's a very good polearm unit and absolutely worth the unlock. We have a minor race transformation that'll make us a little bit richer and more resistant to magic. We have a city structure that gives 20 gold for each magic material within the city's domain. Not terrible, a good way to get extra money. On top of our bazaar, which will also be providing income. The other two things that we'll receive are city structure that actually is pretty good if you're making a lot of money. Buy now is 25% cheaper and can be used 2 times a turn instead of once. And Gilding Blast, perhaps the least interesting thing here, the least powerful thing, though it will give us a stunning little bit of extra gold. I think in this effect, it is the combination of having a couple of pretty interesting city improvements and this big bad boy, the Golden Golem, a fantastic unit. I think that this tome is very strong, provides a lot of different effects, reaches across a lot of different areas. The minor race transformation is nice. The Gold Golem really carries hard here too. I'm ranking this one at either an A tier or an S tier. I could be convinced either way. For the purpose of this video, I'm ranking it at a noted low S tier. I think there are really powerful effects there to make you a lot of money, to build up a large army of those golems, and then you will just destroy. Very strong tome. Our other tier 4 option is Tome of the Crucible, and it's a fairly decent one too, actually. Unfortunately, it doesn't equip us with a unit by default. So instead here we're turning to, as you can see, things like combat spells. Again, we do get this time just one city structure and then some buffs. The city structure itself, battlements grant physical ranged and magic attacks +4 fire damage. Setting those hexes on fire is a nice enough defense. I think that there are some other highlights that should be drawn out here though. And really it's about pure firepower, whether the hero's bringing in extra fire damage, whether you use the meteor shower to cast down meteors on the enemy and really burn them through, or your arrows. There's some strong synergy within this tome. And I think it is a fairly powerful one. All of its effects are fairly powerful, though perhaps not quite as exciting as what some of the others might offer. It's definitely not worth sleeping on this one. I'm going to give the Tome of the Crucible a B tier ranking, a slightly higher one perhaps, but I think it's a fairly middle of the road considering it's a tier 4 unlock. And lastly, we have Tome of the Creator, the tier 5 tome, of course, the hardest to get to out of the lot. We have 4 effects. We can summon in the Titan of the Earth, obviously a very beefy unit, 150 HP, though I would note its damage isn't especially high considering just how massive this thing is. We also receive an upgraded siege project. In this case, it's the Earth Shatter Engines, Siegecraft. We know what Siegecraft does. I don't believe that these are actually especially strong. I think you can conduct sieges perfectly fine with some of the earlier unlocks throughout these tomes, or just in general. I'm not confident that the Earth Shatter engines are quite as impactful as they might sound or look. You then have Tectonic Shatter, which causes 30 physical damage to all enemies, and they have over half chance of being stunned. All obstacles on the world map have half a chance of being destroyed. This is obviously a big strike. 30 damage is not a lot for a max tier spell. It's important to note it is just physical damage as well. The chance of being stunned is alright. It's a powerful impact, don't get me wrong, but it's a little underpowered in comparison to some of the other tier 5 tomes. And then we have Eternal Earth, which grants Undying, which restores units to life after 2 turns. At 50% of their HP. This is potentially a saving grace in what is otherwise pretty underpowered things across the board. Either underpowered or not overly useful. And I'm not sure that this is enough to say that. Because of the extreme length that we have to go to get our tier 5 tomes, among the other pieces of the criteria that I use to evaluate here, I think that this tome, while its effects are powerful, is worthy of either a C or a D tier ranking. Just doesn't quite compete with the rest. I'm going to place it at a D tier. And now we move on to Nature. I think the set that I've given the highest ranks to overall, but I don't want to spoil it. Let's take a look. First up, we're looking at the Tome of Roots, a very powerful one at that. This gives us some healing abilities early on. Healing abilities are, of course, very powerful. Particularly in the early game where armies might be very evenly matched, the extra hit points or regeneration could make or break a fight. Combine that with some extra blight damage from poison blades or poisonous arrows, we then have kind of an extra token unit, right, that we can summon in, 5 living vines. They're not especially strong, though they can entangle the enemy. They're powerful to use tactically or to bring in a few extra tokens into the fight. And then we have the Entwined Thrall, which is, of course, this tome's version of the early summoning unit. Maybe it grows up to be big and strong, but it deals a fairly strong base attack to begin with. That Poison Needle 16, even a melee strike of 12, not terrible. Overall, I think that there's a lot of power inside of the Tome of Roots, not just from summoning units onto the world map, pulling in extra tokens in fights, giving all of our blades and arrows poison, and then, crucially, keeping our units alive. One of the best early combat spells you can get is Healing Roots, and potentially one of the best summoning units that you can get is, at least at this stage, the Entwined Thrall. I think overall, this is a very powerful unlock. Getting food and mana from our special improvement, the Herbalist, is not bad, and the overall nature affinity, while I don't value things like Imperium Tree unlocks, very highly at all when I'm factoring equations in my head to produce these tier lists, it's important to note that the nature affinity is pretty dang good, and I think we'll see that as we move through. I think that the Tome of Roots is a solid, versatile tome with a relatively powerful unit to unlock, healing abilities, and some extra enchantments that can deal a bit of extra damage to boot, all wrapped up in an easy-to-access Tier 1 tome package. I think it deserves an S-tier rating. Tome of Beasts, another very strong contender, and another very strong Tier 1 tome. In this case, of course, we can summon in random Tier 1 animals with a small chance of getting a Tier 2, though our Tier 1 units could grow up into Tier 2s one day anyway. And we see this theme kind of bleed through a little bit. Minor Race Transformation here giving us 10% damage and critical hit chance. Not quite as good as the 20% damage that we've seen from other Minor Race Transformation, but still pretty decent. Note, though, that we have to be adjacent to a friendly animal or cavalry, so there's some other caveats at play to just weaken that down a little bit. We get our support unit here. That's fantastic. Not a terrible unit. Good for an army of beasts. And of course, we have Call of the Wild to buff our beasts or mark the enemy as prey. There's some reasonable beast synergy as you move through. There's also some token synergy that you might want to take into account. And overall, these abilities are fairly strong. Summon Wild Animal can pull up an army very quickly, and you could potentially use the Wild Speaker, maybe in combination with Animal Kinship, to produce a fairly strong, powerful, well-flanked, synergized army. I think that the Tome of Beasts is a very good tome, with some small caveats and relatively minor, but a collection nonetheless of things that just pull it down a little bit in comparison to its peers. I'm going to rank this tome at an A-tier ranking. Again, very solid pick, probably can't go wrong. Maybe not quite as good as the other tome, even within this Tier 1 nature class. If you agreed with me on the Tome of Roots and you like the Tome of Roots, you're going to like the Tome of Glades quite a bit too. This one unlocks our ranged unit that we can build and train. We also get Summon Entwined Protector looking a little bit beefier here, a shield unit with, I would add, healing abilities, plus 20 temporary hit points, and this unit then enters defense mode. A really solid unit. 2-unit unlocks. We have a terraforming spell to create forests or underground mushroom forests, if you wish. We also have this minor race transformation, which sort of bleeds into that as well. We get forest walk, we get forest camouflage. Is it the best minor race transformation? Absolutely not. No, there are definitely more powerful abilities that we can get. However, I guess I have to give it some credit for synergizing well with Create Forest. We at least could make our own territory forest in this tome to give ourselves Forest Walk, Forest Camouflage too. And then the last thing that we get is a unit enhancement, enchantment. I'm going to say that a million times. That mix up. Here it gives us Aspect of the Root, which heals 30 temporary hit points and enters defense mode. Granted units, of course, our shielded units being a great candidate for that, further layering in on top of this healing sap, right? So it's not just that healing sap, but we're spreading the Aspect of the Root across the board. We know the value of healing in keeping units alive, particularly in close fights. This tome also brings us very powerful units, particularly, of course, our Summoned Protector, and then a little bit of a synergy with the forests. I value these forest synergies a lot less than I value almost everything else, including the Sacred Meadow, important to note. We can bring in Forest Warden a little bit to buff it up, but I don't think that's what this tome is really all about. I think it's about powerful units. I think it's about grabbing this aspect, getting a lot of healing online, a lot of strength online, and then falling back on these other things. As far as Tier 2 tomes go, Glades, you are a powerful one. And it is for that reason, all of its juicy offerings, that I'm placing Glades at an S tier. Our second option here is the Tome of Fertility, which doesn't compare in comparison with Glades, it's got to be said. We have this combat spell, summons a flora obstacle, maybe not even quite as useful as our vines, although this can at least deal damage. We have a city structure in the form of the Temple of Fertility, which really is only useful on especially large cities. You're unlikely to get a huge amount of value out of this in comparison to other things that you could be building. We have Restore the Land, Land, which is another terraforming spell, combined with a little bit of healing and another unit unlock, in this case the Nymph. The Nymph is a slightly higher skill level than what we've seen before, and it comes with a few extra abilities. It's actually a pretty nice unit in terms of its overall versatility, and its damage isn't bad, its health isn't bad, it's of course a support unit. I think it's potentially one of the saving graces for this tome, and while not everything here is especially terrible, it just doesn't quite give me enough. The temple just doesn't quite give me enough. Restoring land, yeah, sure, adding grassland, super nice. Not quite enough though. Even the Blossom of Life, potentially, without giving a direct, significant heal, mightn't be enough to get me out of tricky situations. A good tome, but I think fairly average in terms of power level. Because I think it's fairly middle of the road, the Tome of Fertility is going to plant itself smack bang at the B tier. At tier 3, we have the Tome of Vigor, which gives us the upgrade to the animals that we were summoning earlier. In this case, we get to summon tier 3 animals. Pretty decent. We also have the Super Growth Minor Race Transformation, another minor race transformation for us, in this case giving us 10 extra hit points and retaliation attack. This one is pretty nice, honestly, decent enough. We also have Unleash Beast, which of course will buff our friendly beasts. We've got Empower Beast as well. And then we have this interesting combat spell. It summons a Totem of the Wild, which spawns a random tier 1, relatively tokenized unit granted at the start of each of our turns for up to 5 turns. A nice way to bring in extra units into a fight. Potentially then we could look to maybe unleash the beast, empower the beast, and of course we're summoning them in on the world map. Combining that with a nice, a fairly nice trait, and also a fairly nice minor race transformation, I think that the Tome of Vigor is a very solid pick. I don't think it is quite worthy of an S tier, but I give the Tome of Vigor a very comfortable A tier rating. Summoning in those more powerful animals is really good, and the ability to bring in extra token tier 1 units is not to be scoffed at either. Tome of Cycles is a pretty interesting one. It unlocks Druid of the Cycle, which can sort of play with life or death, healing alive units, and bringing perished ones back, or Cycle's End to try and mess with an enemy and get an insta-KO. It's pretty fascinating, and it combines with a lot of the other things that this tome does. Let's take a look, for example, at this healing spell, Parting Gifts, another particular star of the show. Until the end of the battle, whenever a friendly unit dies, all other units within 2 hexes heal plus 12 temporary hit points. Nice to have. Likewise, if you just want to throw damage at the enemy and heal yourself, you have an opportunity to do it here if you diffuse health. Projectiles of Decay, another solid one to deal blight damage and a 90% chance of inflicting decay. There are some reasonably powerful spells here with a pretty good unit, Druid of the Cycle. I think that Cycles is, again, another solid pickup out of the nature tree. This tree really does deliver. This one is a really close call for me, like a really, really close call, but I think it's just not quite as good. Maybe just not quite as good as the other tome that we just looked at within tier 3, right? We're comparing effectively Cycles to Vigor, and I think here we just slightly miss out. I'm going to put it at a B tier. However, I could concede it, I could give a concession and move it to the A tier fairly easily too. At tier 4, we have the Tome of Paradise, the sweet, sweet tome that involves a lot around messing with the enemy, buffing up yourself. For example, take this Pollen spell, which gives you 15 morale and has a really high chance of enemy units, of causing them to become distracted. Gaia's Chosen is another thing to note. It's our major race transformation, giving us a whopping 20 hit points, 3 status resistance, charge resistance as well. It's a pretty good one. Fortress of Vines will give us quite a bit of extra defense, Nature's Bounty focusing on our health. The Blessing of Paradise is a city spell, focusing on stability and making a lot of money. And then it all rounds out with Enchanted Bloom. Target friendly city starts altering terrain to grasslands 1 province per turn. It extends out, and while the spell is active, grassland gives food and production. There are some really nice benefits across the board, some of them used aggressively, others used to transform your race, and they're all generally speaking, pretty powerful. The Garden of Bliss, another opportunity for us to get a lot of stability. If you're after stability, this will, of course, be one of the tomes for you. It doesn't lean into a lot of tomes, and it does feature here. Paradise, I think, is worthy of either an S or an A tier. I think it sits right up the top with some of the best stuff in the game. However, I don't think it's quite good enough to push itself into the top tier, the S tier ranking, and it's for that reason that I'm going to give it a high A tier. Nature's Wrath is our other tier 4 option, and this one pulls some really neat tricks out of the hat. Awaken Forest lets us remove a forest and replace it with an army of animal or plants that come under our control. Super good. Or, if you'd like to, perhaps, turn a province into a forest to get one first, you can with Destructive Regrowth, destroying a province and replacing it with forest while also dealing a bit of damage, so you can use that tactically. There's a nice heal buff here. Heal buff spell, 15 hit points. You also regain all of your action points. Pretty good. Awaken Instincts, potentially the best buff spell that we've seen so far, obviously within nature. We have Devolve, which is a chance to shrink an enemy back down to a tier 1 unit, and all of it is rounded out by this Horned God, our big bad boy coming out of tier 4. It's our mythic unit. It's a huge big plant. It does an incredible amount of damage, and it can also turn Flora obstacles into Flora stingers, bringing in extra units and dealing an incredible amount as it goes along. Super duper strong. Nature's Wrath packs a real punch, not just from healing your own, from bringing in more units like the Horned God, but also the power of Awaken Forest to instantly summon an army is something that we've only really seen in a couple of other tomes at high levels. I think Nature's Wrath is very powerful. In fact, I think Nature's Wrath is so strong that unlike the tome that we looked at just before it, it does slightly reach up and grab an S tier ranking, in my humble opinion. And last, but most certainly not least for nature, we have Tome of the Goddess of Nature, a tier 5 tome, and in this case, we're just getting 3 potentials out of it, the most stripped back out of what we've looked at so far. We have the fact that all forests can grant us vision on the world map. Okay. We have Force of Nature. Enchanted units get 20% crit hit and +4 blight damage. And last but not least, we have Mass Rejuvenation, a healing spell. Heals all friendly units with a whopping 40 temporary hit points, and it brings all dead friendly animals and plants back to life with 50% of their total HP. In other words, we're going to heal all of your army that's alive by a huge amount. 40 temporary hit points is, I think, the most we've seen so far. And any of your animals or plants, which you should have quite a few of, tree people, can come back with 50% of their HP. Mass Rejuvenation is huge, incredibly strong. It makes these other 2 things look pretty non-existent, although they do, of course, have their own value, particularly Force of Nature. I think that Mass Rejuvenation, though, is potentially right up there with one of the best spells in the game. Tome of the Goddess of Nature, your power to swing fights into our control and reanimate our armies, I think makes you worthy of an S tier ranking. Now we move to Order, and we're going to start with the Tome of Zeal, of course a tier 1 tome, providing us with 5 unlocks. A world map summon spell, as we would expect, summoning in a Zealot, not an especially strong unit, of course. A Fanatical Workforce is the city spell, which gives us production in exchange for food, potentially hurting our early growth, though maybe some trade-offs could or should be made. The rest here, Condemnation, of course, dealing but 15 damage and condemning the enemy. Then we have a unit enhancement, Enchantment, which gives us that Zeal and an inspiring chant for a little bit of morale. The abilities here aren't necessarily bad. They're slightly underpowered when you look at them individually and compare them with like-for-like, say, summons or buffs that you might find in other areas. But they do have a reasonable synergy. Of course, we're looking quite a bit at spirit damage here inside of this tome, and to be able to summon in our base unit is always a good start. I believe that the Tome of Zeal is fairly middle of the road in terms of what it gives us, in terms of its overall power level, and for that reason, I'll be placing it at a B tier. Tome of Faith is our other option here, giving us an Abbey, a special province improvement that can give us knowledge, which of course we'll see a little bit more of as we move through the rest of this video, but important to note that they were maybe a little rarer than some of the other things. Here we'll unlock our trainable, recruitable support unit, the Chaplain, which is always nice. We'll also finally gain access to a little bit of that sweet, sweet healing outside of nature. Here, of course, an army heal, giving us not temporary hit points, but actual restoring hit points. We can also leverage stability for a little bit of knowledge, again, harder to get, and there's a little bit of kind of swaying of city-states here with Faithful Whispers. I feel that Tome of Faith reaches out and does a lot of different things. Of course, it has 6 unlocks, the maximum possible, but also just in the diversity of different things that are offered here. I think that earning knowledge is harder to earn than some other resources, so should be given a slight, very minor, but slight kudos for that too. The Tome of Faith, for me, is a low A tier ranking. I think it's just a little bit better than the likes of the B tier. It's of course unlocked very early on as well, so we have to keep that in mind. I'm going to rank it at an A tier. And spoiler alert, we're going to get another A tier ranking here out of the Tome of Inquisition. The Tome of Inquisition unlocks a skirmisher unit for us, one that does a pretty hefty amount of damage, this early on anyway, with the Bolt of Judgment, also likely to stun the enemy for a turn. So it's a powerful effect that will likely knock them down. Here we see a tribunal leveraging population for knowledge. This is unlikely to be as good as some of the other knowledge buildings, but another way to get it, so perhaps I can't complain. And then the rest of what we're looking at here are a variety of spells, including those to cast on the enemy army, like losing 50% of its move points on the world map. Not bad, and one of the ways that you can interfere with enemies before they're strictly fighting with you on the world map. Nice to see. We also have Mass Condemnation, dealing a whole load of spirit damage, and Inquisitor's Zeal, again, leaning into that spirit theme. I think that the Tome of Inquisition is a pretty powerful tome. Gives us some nice effects, some nice synergies, and Mass Condemnation gives us the Burden of Guilt, actually more importantly, gives us a unique impact that other areas don't have. The Tome of Inquisition is a decent tier 2 tome, perhaps not something quite to write home about, but it does present some reasonably strong benefits. I think it's worthy of either an A or a B tier. I'm going to give it a high, quote-unquote, B tier ranking. And our other tier 2 unlock, we have Tome of the Beacon. This one is pretty interesting. I'd like to draw your attention to a couple of things. Firstly, summon Lightbringer, summoning a battle mage unit into the fight. Granted, its spirit bolts don't deal an awful amount of damage, so it's potentially not going to be leading the fight, but it's a good enough unit. There's also a sustained city spell here. Target vassal city grants the player 10 Imperium each turn. Imperium, of course, even more difficult to find sources that produce it. Knowledge, yeah, it's rarer than, say, food. Imperium, rarer still. So it's wonderful to see ways to leverage that. We can also give vassals some souls. And ultimately, cast this, the Tome of the Beacon. This summons a Divine Beacon, which grants +5 temporary hit points and +5 morale at the start of each turn for friendly units within a 2 hex radius. This is a really great way to keep morale high and provide wide-reaching buffs. With the Tome of the Beacon's ability to earn MATERIUM, Imperium, I should say, getting my Iriums confused, heal us up, provide us with some good units and reinforce in that way, I think it presents itself as a very strong tier 2 option. In fact, I think that Tome of Beacon is such a strong tier 2 option that it deserves rightfully to be placed at the S tier for those wonderful constructibles that it delivers, among many other things. Inside the Tome of Sanctuary at tier 3, we have a minor race transformation, which gives us a bit of spirit resistance and status resistance. Potentially the first one there not being quite as useful as the second, and both of them being all right. I think the thing to note here is Healing Spires. which is a city structure, adds 12 healing spires in combat during a siege. Friendly units in the domain heal 12 per turn. So this is a great way to whip down some healing ability that will provide Sanctuary, right? 15 hit points a turn, gains 1 bolstered resistance. It's a pretty neat ability, and I think it's potentially the saving grace. For the rest of this tome, it is not that great. It's probably the best way to summarize it. All of these abilities, don't get me wrong, healing a target of its hit points, its temporary hit points, dispels negative status effects. I mean, these are nice, but they're not super good. I think that the healing spires, though, do lift this up and save it from getting an otherwise somewhat harsher ranking. I give Tome of the Sanctuary, thanks to its 1 or 2 saving graces, a B tier ranking. I think it rightly sits there. I could be convinced 1 either way in this case, but I'm happy with a B. The Tier 3 Tome of Subjugation I just don't think gives enough. It's a little bit of a way for you to potentially subjugate, maybe be a little bit evil inside of Order, which would otherwise be good. You've got things like Baron's Palace, a city structure providing 25 gold if it's built, and can only be built in cities of another race, as well as a little bit of stability. You have Intimidating Aura to reduce morale, Final Ultimatum to potentially boost up your morale, and we unlock the Tyrant King, a heavy shock unit, and a reasonable enough unlock, although this is a somewhat expensive unit given its skill level. A Subjugating Raid also, of course, adds into that Baron's Palace effect, besieged cities losing a population, and it being sort of escorted to your closest owned city. Overall, I think that these impacts are a little bit underpowered. The Tome of Subjugation has some internal synergy, although perhaps it's less synergetic with the entire affinity that it sits within at a whole. It does potentially provide an alternate playstyle, but I don't think it delivers enough power to warrant it any higher than a C tier ranking here on my tier list. At Tier 4, the Tome of Supremacy is a fairly interesting one. We're leaning into morale in particular here, and of course that reoccurring theme of spirit damage as well. And you can see that there's things like Zeal and spirit damage coming through again in some of the buffs. We have the ability to pull up a bit of draft and stability from our city structure, and we'll continue to get morale and strength from further buffs. The unit of note here is the Eagle Rider. It's a flying shield unit, a somewhat unique one, although its damage is fairly low considering its cost is fairly high. You'll be using it as slightly more of course, a shielding and support unit through its emboldened allies, but overall it doesn't really give as much power, particularly in comparison to units within a similar class. It's an exciting unit, but it's not an especially strong one. I think that the Tome of Supremacy delivers some fairly decent spells, fairly strong, and a unit that you'll be glad that you've unlocked for sure. I don't think, though, it really delivers a huge amount of power, and I think it is perhaps marginally better than the Subjugation that we looked at, the Tome that we looked at earlier. And so I think for those reasons, I'm going to place it at a B tier, a slightly higher B tier, but it only just gets there. Now we look at the Tome of Exaltation, the other Tier 4 tome in Order. This one unlocks Shrine of Smithing. It's a unit, believe it or not. It's a mythical unit. It packs a big punch. It's got a lot of health. You'll be glad that you've got this on your side of the fight, mark my words. In terms of our city structure, again, of course, we're leaning into city stability. In this case, also mana. If the city has no governor, its governor bonus will be doubled. If it has a governor, I should say, you'll get twice the effect. Outside of that, I'd also like to highlight the major race transformation that's on offer here, turning our units into celestial units with extra spirit resistance, -4 for blight and frost, and also control loss immunity, making you immune to the effects that make you lose control of a unit. So fairly strong. Combine that, of course, with the fact that you'll fly and that you'll be faithful, which will reduce your upkeep. It's a fairly nice major race transformation. We also have Ascended Warriors, giving non-hero units in an army +1 rank. That's a really nice buff spell. And then we have, of course, Angel Eyes, that major race transformation going along with everything else that I think actually brings together a fairly strong tome here inside of Order. It could be one of the strongest ones that we've looked at so far. I think its real power is the mythic unit that it brings in, but everything around the edges is nice enough too, that it's a strong enough tome, especially with a major race transformation inside. I give the Tome of Exaltation a high A tier. I think a case could be made for S. I could be convinced that way. As usual, it's usually a plus or minus one either way, but I'm pretty confident with that ranking, and I think it deserves to be placed there. And then we have Tome of the God Emperor. Our tier 5 tome, become a god to be worshipped. Your mere presence inspires your troops specialize in buffing units. What do we get? Friendly army spell units and target friendly army gain resurgence for 1 turn. When it dies in combat, it's revived at the end. If its owner is victorious, revived units are brought back with 50%. We then have Exalted Champion for 3 turns. Target friendly unit deals plus 100% damage and has a huge amount of defense. That's a very strong buff spell. We have Wrath of the Emperor, which is an enemy army spell, dealing sustained 20 spirit damage, becoming demoralized, condemned, and if they're in enemy territory, they get an extra 50% damage. And then finally, and perhaps the most significantly of all, Mass Revive. Targets all friendly dead units with Faithful or Zeal, something of course you've undoubtedly been able to pick up and sort of craft into your people by now. They come back to life with 50% of their total hit points. Mass Revive, you are huge. And of course we combine that with a few other buffs around the edge. I think that Mass Revive is enough to make this tome exceptionally good. Spells that can bring your entire army back with 50% are game-changing spells. They will make or break almost any fight. And if your opponent can't do it back to you, they better have really whooped your backside because you're about to resummon everybody. And I think that that is in of itself enough to lift this tome up to greatness. For all of your hard work in being a good emperor, I think you deserve an S tier ranking. Rounding out our penultimate section and leading us through into the Shadow Realm. We begin with the Tome of Souls, of course. The soul economy will exist inside. Here we have unlock for the Bone Golem. A fairly decent unit, actually, in terms of early on. They're created in a city using souls or by fusing 2 skeletons together, though. So there is a little bit that you have to keep in mind before you can get these online. However, you shouldn't struggle to bring skeletons into your army. The rest across here, we have a variety of spells. Damage spells, unit enchantments, obviously, and buff spells to boot. I would notice that there's no direct way to bring in any units, and we don't unlock any specific units, of course, outside of the Bone Golem. The spells themselves aren't terrible. Soulbound, for example, allowing us to generate more souls. We could deal some direct damage, and, of course, we grab Soul Harvest and the Soul Collector as well, novice hero skill. So it comes together to start the form the basis of a soul economy, but it doesn't deliver a lot of strength and it doesn't provide me with a lot of immediate options. Given its lack of immediate impact and the overall sort of slightly underwhelming performance of this tome, I'm going to give it a C tier ranking. The other tier 1 option available for Shadow is the Tome of Cryomancy. This one does provide us with our unit options. We get access to the Battle Mage that inflicts Frozen. We also get access to summon in this version of our crappy little spirits. Of course, they can grow up big and strong, and in this case, we've got the Lesser Snow Spirit. And the rest of the theme here is, of course, all about that snow. It's about frost damage, whether it be on our blades or our arrows, similar, of course, to effects that we've seen before for lightning or in nature. We also have an enemy army spell that causes a blizzard. This is a fairly standard run-of-the-mill introductory tome. It does unlock a few units. I don't think that a lot else of what it does is especially useful, though, especially when you consider that we're losing a bit of physical damage in exchange for this frost damage. So we do have to focus in a little harder here than we might potentially with other unit types, right? There's almost an anti-synergy, of course, at play inside of this as well. Important to note, we'll grab the School of Cryomancy, giving us a little bit of extra knowledge, potentially a slight saving grace, but across the board there is a little bit of an anti-synergy here, although we do unlock some early units. For some slight anti-synergies and an overall lack of power, compared to its peers, particularly within its tier grouping of tier 1. I'm going to place this tome again at a C tier ranking, putting both of our options from this grouping at C tier. At tier 2, we continue our focus on souls, with the Soul Well, a special province improvement, giving us a few souls, though of course not as many as we could get in combat. Speaking of which, we have our Necromancer come in, our support unit, a reasonable enough unlock, and then we're surrounded by a bunch of spells. Raises target corpses in a 1-hex radius as zombie units that die at the end of combat. A Rotting Explosion, dealing 15 and 15 and applying Decaying. Necrotic Magic, which gives us just a 60% chance of inflicting Decaying damage over time effect. So that is not great odds, but it's a unit enchantment. So all of our attacks will roll those die. And then finally, Restore the Undead. 20 hit points of all undead units in a target army. And that's, of course, a friendly army spell. Overall, these impacts, I think, are not terrible, but they're also really in and around average in terms of their overall impact. The damage is fairly low. The healing potential is fairly low, not even striking into temporary hit points, unfortunately, in this case. And the unit enchantment, I mean, yeah, Decaying is nice, 5 blight damage a turn, but we're really going to need to give and deal a little bit more if we want to be competitive with other tomes in this tier grouping. Not to sound like a broken record, I swear I'll give one of these tomes something other than C, but I think that this tome deserves a C tier ranking, just slightly below average for what we might compare to within that tier 2 ranking, though not, of course, inherently a bad pick. You will need to lean into the Souls economy as well to make it work. Obviously that goes without saying, but important to note nonetheless. Tome of the Doomherald is up next, providing us with a summoning spell for a Banshee, a unit that I personally don't think deals enough damage or has enough effect to warrant summoning it. There are other summoning options that I think are much better than this one across other tomes. I just don't feel like it delivers enough, even potentially in comparison to some of the units that I'm just training that will have ultimately lower upkeeps, at least when you look at them across their opportunity cost, and frankly, deal more damage than this guy. The rest of what's on offer out of these 5 unlocks, as you can see, are all spells. We have a minor race transformation that lets us steal 3 morale per hit. Not the best transformation. In fact, I would argue it's probably one of the worst. A little bit of morale dealing is great. If you're winning a fight, you're going to win slightly more. If you're losing a fight, you're going to lose slightly less, but the impact is really not that profound, and it's not going to turn the tide of a fight. It's no plus 20% damage by any stretch of the imagination. And the rest of the spells here, like I say, good enough, definitely, but a little bit situational and arguably just not impactful enough to compete. I think that the Doomherald is one of our rare but not all that uncommon D tier rankings. It doesn't deliver enough on any front. It doesn't have a single saving grace even to lift it up from the dredges of D tier. And in a complete shift, we have the Tome of Great Transformation, one of these tier 3 tomes that has so much power packed into it, it's almost unjust. Taking a look at a couple of other things before we get to the real juicy stuff. We have a city structure that replaces our defensive towers. It heals undead units within 6 hex for 15 hit points. You might be thinking, well, I'm not an undead unit. Oh, but wait, there's more. We have the Domain of Death, which gives us a little bit of stability. It's a sustained city spell, nice enough. A neat little world spell that can upgrade resource nodes, so they'll give you an extra 5 mana per turn. Nice to have. Let's get into the juicy stuff though. We have a unit enchantment which will give us plus 10 hit points across a huge variety of unit types, and ultimately we have this major race transformation at tier 3, so it's quite early for a major transformation, and boy does it pack a punch. We become undead, which, yes, as you can see, will change our resistance levels, it'll change our morale modifiers, we'll be immune to poison, and crucially, it'll give us lifesteal. Our unit's attacks will heal ourselves for 10 temporary hit points, with an additional 5 coming from repeating attacks. When you combine the extra resistance with this major race transformation ability across the rest of this tome, it is a very powerful one indeed. The Great Transformation transforms for me what was so far looking like a pretty weak group of tomes and surges itself right up to the top. I think rightfully claiming a spot that only one other, in my opinion, of the Shadow tomes will be able to reach. It deserves an S tier for its major race transformation implications. We also have the Tome of the Cold Dark, causing enemies to become blind and spreading Arctic terrain. Of course, that's done through this terraforming spell, which extends up to 2 provinces outside of the domain, slowly converting it over to provinces with snow and ice, which will give you a little bit of extra food and production. You'll be able to summon the more powerful Snow Spirit unit, which doesn't deal a huge amount of damage through individual strikes, but is fairly decent in combat. You'll receive a general terraforming spell as well, Altered Terrain to Arctic, giving enemies frost damage and really leaning into what you do best. The minor race transformation is interesting here too, leaning into the internal synergy, extra frost resistance, immune to frozen, and you'll get Arctic Walk. And this all comes together with a friendly army spell. The target of the army gains universal camouflage for 3 turns, so it can't be seen at all on the world map. So there's some really interesting opportunities to be quite stealthy here, to build up a frozen domain around yourself, and harvest a little bit of extra knowledge as well out of the special improvement. I think that the Cold Dark is a pretty powerful tome. I would generally pick it up. I think it's a good pick. It's not an S tier pick though. The internal synergies of the Cold Dark is something to be proud of, and some of its effect, like the extra unit, like the race transformation for example, I think set it above the rest. I tossed and turned between whether I wanted to place this one at a B tier or an A tier. I think it deserves to live somewhere in between. I'll be ranking it at a quote-unquote low A tier. Tome of the Reaper will probably be a decent pickup for you. You get this fairly expensive, and while it doesn't deal the most damage, it does have some pretty interesting abilities like greater corpse consumption, which is a brilliant one if you're leaning down that undead route, which of course by this point you will be. You also get Harvest Population, which is a fairly interesting one. You get to harvest a population for 60 souls, helping you potentially build up your soul economy a little bit more. One of the rare ways you'll be able to do that. And you can construct soul siphons, gaining 40 souls during a siege. I think that there's some good internal synergies here around souls, around the undead, and a nice enough unit unlock with a very powerful ability. But I don't think that the Tome of the Reaper is anywhere near as strong as some of the others that we've just looked at, especially when we consider that it's up at tier 4. I think that Tome of the Reaper is worthy of a middle-of-the-road ranking, placing it somewhere in the bottom half of the B tier picks. The Tome of Oblivion summons the Living Fog, a very sort of large, high health unit that, granted, doesn't deal a huge amount of damage with its Mind Strike, but can inflict insanity on the enemy as well as it damaging fortified obstacles. The insanity thing comes through with things like Sleep of Oblivion, Devouring Void conjures a void, which each turn sort of pulls enemies into the void, dealing 30 damage, and the Fog of Insanity completes the effect as a sustained city spell. I think that there are reasonable benefits here within the Tome of Oblivion. It's sometimes difficult to manage their impact because they rely quite heavily on the impacts of insanity, for example, playing out, the unit becoming uncontrollable, attacking random units within a certain range. So there is, of course, an element of randomness to it, but I think that the effects are strong enough. Tome of the Reaper could change the tide of battle with some reasonable insanity plays. It is unlocked at tier 4, making it a bit more expensive, but I think it warrants a low B tier. And now we arrive at our final tome. Tome of the Eternal Lord. What do you do at tier 5, and are you worthy? Well, there's a combat enchantment that gives us 15 frost damage, with a 90% chance of blinding and weakening them. We have Ray's Undead Army, summoning a full stack of low-tiered undead units onto a target world. This is our ability to quickly draw an army out of nowhere inside of these tomes. And while we don't get it till the very end, it shouldn't be slept on. Even if they are fairly weak units, being able to pull them out of nowhere, potentially merge them in to even stronger skeletal units using our spells, should not be slept on. True Death Magic is a unit enchantment. It grants magic attacks a 30% chance of inflicting marked for death. The unit will not recover hit points and will die when the effect expires. It's only a 30% chance, but if we can get that from all of our magic attacks, we're probably going to deal some pretty decent damage. And then finally, we have Battlefield Reanimation. All friendly undead units come back to life with 50% of their hit points, and enemy corpses come back to life as tier 1 zombies under your control until the end of the battle. This is one of those effects that, like a couple of others in a couple of the other tier 5 tomes, could completely change the fight. Not just reanimating our army, providing they're undead, which of course they should be at this point, they should all be, but also bringing the enemies back as extra token units to throw in the line of fire. Tome of Eternal Lord therefore sets itself apart from the rest, of course, right up there with those other tier 5 tomes that give us this ability, and I therefore rank it at an S tier. And that, my friends, concludes my Tomes of Magic tier list ranking. What did you think? I'm sure there'll be plenty of disagreement. There always is on these kinds of videos where there's a little bit, of course, of objectivity, of personal plays and experiences bleeding into the overall analysis. Do let me know what you think, regardless. I'm always keen to hear your good feedback, and I'll see you after I've rested my voice in the next one. Take care, everybody.